Peter wasn't just crucified. Paul wasn't simply beheaded. Thomas wasn't merely pierced with spears. To us, these are tragic endings. But to the people who witnessed them nearly 2,000 years ago, the method of execution spoke a language everyone understood. Long before newspapers or television, empires used executions as public messages. Every cross, every sword, every stone was designed to tell the crowd something about power, justice, and fear. The Romans believed that if they could control how a person died, they could control how that person would be remembered. But history took a very different turn, because the deaths that were meant to erase the apostles became some of the strongest testimonies to their faith. And once you understand what these executions meant in the ancient world, you'll never read their stories the same way again. Let's begin with the most famous of them all, Peter. According to early Christian tradition, Peter was sentenced to die by crucifixion during the persecution of Christians under Emperor Nero around AD 64 or 67. Tradition also says Peter requested to be crucified upside down because he believed he was unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. Whether that specific detail is historical or a later tradition, one fact is beyond dispute. Peter was condemned to one of the most feared punishments in the Roman world. Today, when we see a cross, we think of hope. The Romans saw something entirely different. To them, the cross represented absolute humiliation. Crucifixion was deliberately public. Victims were often stripped of their clothing. They were displayed where thousands of people would pass by, sometimes along major roads, sometimes outside city gates, sometimes on hills where everyone could see. This wasn't simply execution. It was psychological warfare. Rome wanted every traveler, every merchant, every child, and every soldier to look at that cross and reach the same conclusion. Do not challenge Rome. The famous Roman statesman Cicero described crucifixion as the most cruel and horrifying punishment imaginable. Respectable Roman citizens were generally protected from it because it was considered too degrading. The purpose of crucifixion wasn't simply to kill, it was to destroy a person's honor. In the ancient Mediterranean world, honor was everything. A person's reputation determined how they were treated, who respected them, and even how future generations remembered them. Rome understood that. So instead of quietly executing rebels behind prison walls, they displayed them publicly. The message wasn't only for the victim. The real audience was the crowd. To Roman officials, that proved one thing: their empire had won. To many bystanders, it meant Peter had suffered the ultimate disgrace. But something happened that Rome never expected. Christians began talking about it. They repeated the story. They preserved it. They honored it. The very punishment designed to silence Peter became part of his legacy. This was completely backwards. Christianity remembered its martyrs instead of forgetting them. And Peter was only the beginning. If Peter died on a cross, why didn't Paul? If Rome wanted to make an example of Christianity's leaders, why give one apostle the empire's most humiliating death and another a far quicker one? The answer has nothing to do with mercy. It has everything to do with status. Paul was a Roman citizen. We know this from the book of Acts. When Roman officials prepared to flog him, Paul asked a simple question: is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? The soldiers stopped immediately. They knew the consequences of violating a citizen's rights. Even the commander became alarmed after learning Paul had been bound illegally. That single moment reveals something many people overlook. Rome was brutal, but it was also deeply legalistic. Power was exercised through laws, and citizenship placed a person under special protection. To modern ears, beheading sounds just as horrifying as crucifixion. But in the first century, the difference was enormous. Crucifixion was intentionally slow. Victims could suffer for hours, sometimes even days. They were mocked, exposed, and left hanging in public view. Beheading, by contrast, was swift. It wasn't considered an act of compassion. It was considered an execution fitting for someone who possessed legal status. Rome was saying, "We will take your life, but we will still follow our law." Ironically, the empire that sought to destroy Christianity ended up confirming something about Paul that Christians would remember forever. Even Rome recognized that he was a citizen, just not the kingdom he preached about. Imagine witnessing these two executions. To the average Roman, they communicated different messages. Peter's death warned slaves and rebels. Paul's execution demonstrated that even citizenship had limits. No one stood above Caesar. Or so it seemed, because within a few generations the empire would discover that swords could silence voices, but not ideas. As Christianity spread across the empire, believers didn't hide the stories of Peter and Paul. They repeated them, copied them, read them aloud in house churches. The executions intended to discourage faith became evidence of unwavering conviction. Now, to understand the deaths of the other early Christian leaders, let's first look at the very different systems of justice that shaped their world. By the 1st century, two very different systems of justice existed side by side. One belonged to Rome, the other belonged to the Jewish religious authorities. The Romans executed people to display imperial power. But under Jewish law, punishment was intended to preserve the holiness of the community. That difference changes how we understand one of Christianity's earliest martyrdoms. James. According to the 1st century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, James was condemned by the Sanhedrin around AD 62 and was stoned after being accused of breaking the law. This James was not one of the 12 apostles. He was the leader of the Jerusalem church and one of the most influential figures in early Christianity. His story helps us understand what stoning communicated in the Jewish world. When modern readers imagine stoning, they usually focus on its brutality. Ancient Jews understood something deeper. Stoning was a public declaration. It meant, this person has placed himself outside the covenant community. To Christians, however, James's death meant something entirely different. Instead of proving that the gospel had failed, it convinced believers that following Christ could cost everything. The very punishment intended to silence the church strengthened its resolve. Thomas. According to one of Christianity's oldest traditions, Thomas carried the gospel as far as India. Ancient Christian writings, especially the Acts of Thomas, describe him preaching among local communities before eventually being killed with spears. Unlike Peter's crucifixion or Paul's beheading, historians debate many details surrounding Thomas's final days. But the tradition itself has endured for centuries. What matters is understanding what the spear represented in the ancient world. A spear wasn't a judicial instrument like the cross, it was a military weapon. It symbolized force, authority, conquest. When early Christians remembered Thomas dying by the spear, they weren't celebrating violence. They were proclaiming that even military power could not stop the spread of the gospel. Ironically, Thomas is remembered today not for the weapon that killed him, but for the churches that trace their origins to his ministry. The weapon disappeared. The message remained. At this point, it is important to note that not every apostle's final days are preserved with the same clarity. Take Bartholomew, for example. One tradition says he was flayed alive before being executed. Another says he was beheaded. Other ancient sources tell the story differently. So what should we believe? The honest answer is, we don't always know. The farther we move from the New Testament, the more our sources rely on traditions preserved by later Christian communities. Some traditions are ancient. Some are reliable. Others remain impossible to verify, and that's not a weakness. It's actually good history. Real historians distinguish between what we know, what we think, and what tradition remembers. When we separate evidence from tradition, something surprising happens. The apostles become even more believable. Because Christianity didn't preserve perfect biographies. It preserved faithful memories. Some are crystal clear. Others remain mysterious. And perhaps that's fitting. After all, the purpose of the apostles was never to make themselves famous. It was to point beyond themselves. Despite their different stories, their different cultures, and their different deaths. The message was clear that neither Rome nor the religious authorities could stop the gospel. Thank you for watching, and do not forget to like and subscribe. Bye.